Hello, welcome to the Media Reporter. I'm Jaclyn Tyndorf. Today we have a great show for you. We have Jennifer Manner. Thank you for joining us, Jennifer.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about the telecommunications industry and how it does affect the average person. So I wanted to know if you can explain a little bit about the National Broadband Plan.
Sure. The National Broadband Plan was a document that the Federal Communications Commission prepared at the request of Congress. And what it does is it sets out a plan for the country for increasing access to broadband. And the reason why broadband is so important is that almost everyone today relies on the internet and data communications for important information, whether that's for their health, information on health or telehealth, telemedicine, education. For instance, there's a tremendous number of students today, especially on the college level and above, who get their education over the internet. Public safety and homeland security is really critical. For instance, just this past year, the United States launched a new service called CMAS, or Commercial Mobile Alerting Service, where you actually get text messages over your cell phone for emergency notifications, things like hurricanes and tornadoes. So really what the National Broadband Plan looked at was how to enable increased access to broadband services for a whole variety of uses and across the country.
So you mentioned people can receive text message alerts on their cell phones. How do people need to have a certain cell phone to do so?
That's a great question. So this system is only coming into effect. It went into effect in April of 2012. And so the cell phones are slowly being switched out. What they found is that most people get a new cell phone every 2 years. So the next time you get a new cell phone, you'll most likely purchase one that is enabled with this service, and then you'll be able to receive it. But it's going to take time for the service to be fully deployed. It actually requires states and localities to upgrade their networks. So some areas have it available today, and some areas it'll take some more time. But eventually you'll be able to get, almost anyone who has a cell phone will be able to get a text message alert for things like hurricanes and tornadoes, but only issues that are affecting where they're located. It's location based. So it really is an exciting new way to give emergency alerts to Americans.
And is this purely weather related alerts, or could they be a range of alerts that they'll receive?
That's a great question too, a range. So all of us are used to getting them on our television today, where you hear a very loud sound and says this is an emergency alert, and oftentimes they'll be warning about a weather event. But governments can also use them for other things, such as natural disasters, other emergencies. And of course there's also something called a presidential alert. It's never been done before, but if ever the president had to reach all the people in the country, that's another place. The other thing is for Amber Alerts for missing children, and so that's a really good service. If people receive Amber Alerts on their cell phone, it'll mean more people are out looking for that poor child.
And to find out more information about these services, if people aren't sure if their cell phone provides it, where can they look to find out if they're able to receive these?
They should ask their service provider, and the service provider should be able to tell them.
Okay. Another thing that you had mentioned was about 911 services.
Yes.
How has that developed over the past few years or even decade?
That's a great question. So I think this is a really exciting area. Just so folks know, 911 services are, of course, what you dial during an emergency to receive help. And when you call from your landline phone, it's very easy to be located because your landline phone is stationary and they know that you're the subscriber at 123 Main Street. What happened with the introduction of cell phones was all of a sudden, even if they knew you were a subscriber and your address was 123 Main Street, you may not be located at your house when the alert came, when you had a call for an emergency. So you could be, your car you could have gotten into an accident on a road and called, but no one would know where you are. Well, you might be able to give that information. For instance, if you didn't know where you were, you couldn't give that information, or if you were unable to provide it. So one of the things that the FCC required several years ago was location accuracy. So today, if you're using your cell phone, it has to be accurate. There's location information that's transmitted to first responders, so they know pretty close to where you are. And that's been extended also to VoIP, Voice over Internet Protocol providers. Today, the FCC and other agencies are looking at ways to extend this even more. For instance, today if you text to 911, you won't be able to get help except in a few select markets where they're running some tests. So the FCC now is considering putting in a requirement which would enable texting to 911. So for instance, let's say you're not able to complete a phone call, all you could do is text, you could send a text message, and that would work the same way. And the FCC is also looking at other things. One of the things that would be very helpful to first responders is if they could receive photos. They'd have increased situational awareness. So other things the Commission is looking at is how to enable photos and other pictures and more data to be sent to 911. And then that data, for instance, could be shared with first responders who are responding to the emergency.
And is there a time frame where you think this would take effect, or is this still in the planning process?
I think it's still early. Not only do the rules have to change, but the emergency responders have to be able to upgrade their equipment. So I think you'll start to see this roll out in the next couple of years, but it'll be a slow process because you also want to make sure you get it right because people's lives are at stake.
And does the 911, does that tie into the National Broadband Plan at all? Is there any relationship between the two?
Yes, actually one of the chapters of the Broadband Plan and one of the areas that a lot of focus was on public safety and homeland security, especially with broadband technologies and the ability to send large amounts of data over communications and photos and videos. That was an important piece. And so the National Broadband Plan actually called for what we call next generation 911, this 911 where you could start to send data and photos and pictures over the systems.
Okay, and then I know other things that you've done in your background focused on spectrum. How would you explain what spectrum is to someone walking on the street, and how does spectrum impact their daily lives?
That's a great question. So I think the simplest way to think of spectrum, it's the airwaves over which non-wired communications travel. So things like your broadcast television, your cell phone communications. And so it's basically a non-wired way to receive communications. And it's incredibly important because it's a scarce resource. There's only a certain amount of spectrum that's available. And so one of the important issues that the U.S. government deals with is how to make sure it's used efficiently so that it can be used for its highest and best purpose. And so, for instance, with the demands of broadband, more and more spectrum is used. For instance, it's over 20% more spectrum to use a smartphone than it was in a traditional telephone. So all these new technologies that are coming on the market, which are so exciting, require increased ability to get spectrum. And so you have to think of efficient ways to do that because you do want Americans and citizens across the country to have access to the best and most technologically advanced communications.
We're going to take a look now at Jennifer's presentation.
Right now, did you know if you call 911, can you text to 911? Does anyone know? If you send a text message to 911, what happens?
Let's find out.
Not a lot, nothing. And so it's so antiquated. So one of the things we're all working on now is bringing it to next generation. Same with alerting. Today, who has a newish phone they bought in the past 3-4 months? Anyone? What sort of communications students? Anyway, if you do, you have commercial mobile alerting system or plan, but basically you'll get a text message. If you know on your TV when there's like a hurricane coming, it's like that really annoying tone, right? Now you can get that on your phone. So but the nice thing is it's located at what affects you. So if you're in Lower Manhattan and something is happening in Jersey, you wouldn't be alerted. But you would be alerted of stuff in Lower Manhattan that might affect you. So it's location based. As new technology comes up, it doesn't matter if there's new technology if consumers don't know what it means, or if you adopt a regulation and consumers don't understand a regulation. We were talking earlier, I met with a few students over coffee, 911. We were talking about 911 before a little bit. It used to be that when I was working for the commissioner, there was no location accuracy. So if you called 911 from a cell phone, this was in the mid-2000s, no one knew where you were. They just knew that you were a subscriber who lived on Main Street. They didn't know where you were calling from. So there were horrible incidents of people being able to call for help. There was a woman in New York who was able to call for help, and it was in the trunk of a car for 2 hours and ended up dead because no police couldn't find her because she didn't know where she was. She was in a trunk. But if you don't tell people, so the FCC actually adopted rules requiring location accuracy in devices, in cell phones, which actually is why you have so many location accuracy apps today. Was really not a market-based, it was not a market-based regulation. But if you didn't explain to people what this meant, there would be mass confusion, and people were concerned about privacy and other things. So it's very important that the regulator have a portion of it that's focused on consumer outreach. And this is true for industry too. Regulation in the United States was somewhat odd. You've gone through kind of how everything happened, I'm assuming? Yes. So, right, so we had a monopoly, and this is true in every country, right? So if you went back into the 1880s, 1980s, almost everywhere in the world telecommunications was provided by a monopoly service provider. They provided basic phone service. The United States had a private sector entity, AT&T. Almost every other country but Finland and the Dominican Republic, for some strange reason, had government-owned monopolies. And then what happened was, a couple of things happened, although you say they didn't really hear of the internet till the mid-90s, but in the 80s, the internet was developed. Second, when I was in, right around, I don't even remember when, the Soviet Union fell, collapsed, right? Does anyone even remember?
The Soviet Union.
Right. The Soviet, when the Soviet Union and the world became a lot more global, because a huge enemy was gone. So you had globalization, which meant that companies were starting to expand. So you had internet, you had globalization, and you just had increased business and so forth. And there was a demand, all of a sudden companies, not people necessarily, but companies, remember this is all economic. Everything your professor teaches you is based on economics. Companies wanted to get service in new markets. So all of a sudden, oh, pick your favorite company that was around. IBM. IBM all of a sudden had offices in Russia, and it wanted really good, reliable phone service. But would you buy service from Ruski Telecom? It was probably awful. Most of the rest of the world, where the US had really high teledensity, because we actually had universal service requirements, the rest of the world didn't. And we're talking, when I started teaching, 10 years ago, half the people in the world hadn't even made a phone call. 50% of the people of the world's population in, what year is it, in 2002 hadn't made a phone call, much less used a cell phone. So if you go back to the 80s, we're talking countries that had 20% teledensity. So that brought in competition, but the monopolists, you'll be a monopolist because you work for Reliance. If you were a monopolist, would you want competition?
No, absolutely not.
Right. So what they wouldn't do, and if you were the government and you own the phone company, what's your interest? You're making money. You don't want to lose revenue. So when companies were coming into these markets, including in the U.S., the only markets that they really cared to open up at first was what we call enhanced services or value-added services. And so there was a big debate over what you call a value-added service. The United States decided to call enhanced services things that weren't basic services. So basically things like fax. Do you even know what a fax is? Do we even use faxes? Fax, telex, which I can't imagine anyone remembers. Email. We all have email still. But those sorts of services were enhanced because they were things that rode on what the basic phone company was providing. What's really, so the U.S. actually defined these services as basic and said, you know what, you can't regulate, we're not going to regulate those because they're competitive services, or we're going to have a very lightly regulated. So what's happening now and where we're having lots of problems is all of a sudden there aren't really any basic services because the public switch basic telephone is going away. Everything's internet-based, and some of our biggest debates in Washington and around the world are, how do you regulate the internet? And what is the internet? And I argue it actually goes further, because it used to be that your service providers didn't also provide search engines, didn't also provide content. So I'll give you an example. You probably haven't taught of undersea cables. Yeah.
You mean from Halifax to
yeah. So your telecommunication services globally go undersea, are usually transmitted by undersea cables. These giant cables that lay under the sea, giant cables. They're big facilities. It used to be that phone companies own them. Well, it turns out that Facebook now owns one, and Google now owns one. So they're basically providing what would traditionally be considered a basic telecommunication services, but they don't want to be regulated because they provide internet service. And there's a big debate, and some of you may have read about it. There's an upcoming meeting, it's in the press all the time, called the WICET, the World Conference on International Telecommunications. It's being held in Geneva. And there's a big movement by many countries of the world, led by China and Russia. And the claim is that they want to regulate the internet on a global basis. The US is very against this. This upcoming conference is going to be held in Dubai in December, called the WICET, which you may want to take a look, and if you email me, I'll send you some stuff on it. Is really interesting, because there's these countries like China and Russia, and some other countries that aren't quite seen as so difficult, politically feel that there needs to be some certain standards internationally for things like cybersecurity and so forth. This year, Congress passed legislation to create an authority under the Department of Commerce to build out a public safety broadband network across the country. It'll be the first interoperable network. It'll be a dedicated network for public safety. They were awarded, based on a cost model I did, $7 billion to build out this network. They can also lease they were given a certain amount of spectrum, 20 megahertz, which is a lot. They're allowed to lease some of it to support their services. So that's kind of something else that I think is a really monumental change, in that public safety's never had a nationwide network. So if everyone's on the same network, just like I'm able to talk to any of you, because I'm on Verizon, maybe you have AT&T, we can, all of a sudden, public safety, and public safety always had a problem talking because it's command and control, and so jurisdictions didn't always want to share information, so this was kind of a big change. Spectrum is a scarce resource, and the big question is, how do we put more uses in? And the only part of it really very good. No one really wants most of it. They all want to be in the very low portion of it. So how do you enable spectrum use? Some of it's moving services out, but most people don't want to move, because if you have property rights, why give them up? So instead, what's being looked at is, how do you share spectrum with other services? And this is a complex policy and technical issue. So pretty much this part is the valuable part of the spectrum. Everything else, not so valuable. This area here is what the incentive auction is. This is like a really sweet spot. This is where LTE, everyone knows about LTE, right? Because it's advertised. Does anyone know what it stands for? Long-term evolution. Very good. You get a plus. LTE is in this band. This is the band that's going to be, I think, is right about here. And LTE is here, and this is what's going to be auctioned in the reverse and forward auctions. So it's a very exciting area. It's a big amount of spectrum. The big question is, how many broadcasters will really give up their business, even if they're paid? Because they're not just giving up their spectrum, essentially they're selling their businesses. And so the question is, does it make sense? Other things that are interesting on convergence, I want to talk a little bit about, does everyone know what the Dish Network is? It's one of the DBS, one of the satellite providers. It's owned by a man named Charlie Ergen, who started out selling satellite dishes out of the back of his truck. He's now richer than Rupert Murdoch. So he did pretty well. He operates actually the 5th largest satellite fleet in the world, but he also bought up satellite spectrum. He wants to use terrestrial use for broadband so that he would have a combined satellite terrestrial network, which would just get you service pretty much anywhere. Spectrum, different portions of the frequency bands have different propagation characteristics. I'm looking at these guys because they're going to laugh at me. How far they can carry, and whether they can go through walls and other things. So it turns out that spectrum below what we'd say is 3 gigahertz, which I can't really see on the chart, is, because the number is small, is extremely good spectrum for wireless services, because one, it travels a reasonable distance and it's able to penetrate walls to a certain extent. But the truth of the matter is, one of the things we're looking at is it doesn't really penetrate walls that well, so you're also starting to see the development of small cells and femtocells, which are smaller cellular networks. So for instance, Wi-Fi is a good example of a small cell network, so you complement what you have. But basically, spectrum below 3 gigahertz is seen as incredibly valuable, and because it's below 3 gigahertz, it's incredibly scarce because there's only a smaller amount of spectrum. And if you actually think, our jurisdiction goes up to 300 gigahertz, and so if you think about only the first 3 gigahertz are valuable, that's a pretty strong statement, and a lot of people are in there already, not just commercial users. This is the table of frequency allocations. Do you know it's got 2 sides? It's got a federal table and there's a non-federal table. Have you taught this?
No.
Okay. So we have different, the way the United States works, the FCC manages the non-federal table of frequency allocations for non-federal users, which is folks like public safety, commercial industry, utilities, all those sorts of folks. But there's a matching table. If you went to Part 2 of the FCC's rules, you'd see the table, so 47 CFR Part 2. You'd see the table written out with what the services are, and there's a federal part, and there's a non-federal part. The federal part's what DOD uses, what NOAA, what the National Weather Service uses. It's where the radio astronomers are. All these services, that radars, things, drones that fly over, all the stuff that you won't really know too much detail about. But there's thousands and thousands of megahertz of spectrum that are only used by the federal government or shared with commercial users, non-federal users, but oftentimes has a lot of constraints because of those other uses. So ideally, well, there's an argument that some users don't use spectrum as efficiently as others. The broadcasters are one. Folks would argue that the Department of Defense is another, because they argue that the federal government doesn't use the spectrum as efficiently as it should because there's no commercial incentives. And if you think about it, it's true. If you have to pay for your spectrum, oftentimes you're more efficient, and that's the reason that the U.S. started doing auctions for spectrum. Originally, the U.S. just licensed, and then what happened was more people wanted license. So we did something horrible called a comparative hearing, where we would put 2 people together. You're both in purple, but I decided which color purple I liked better, and I kind of like your shade, so you'd get the license. So that wasn't very objective. Then we decided there had to be a better way, so we did lotteries. And we'd put a lot of people, everyone would go in the hat, and it could be my mother, didn't matter. And we'd pull someone out and they would get the license, and what we ended up was with a lot of people who didn't know what to do with the spectrum because they didn't value it, they got it for free, getting spectrum. So that's when the U.S. decided in about 92, 93, there was legislation that gave the FCC auction authority. And the idea is, though I don't fully believe this, that is whoever pays the highest amount for spectrum values it the most. What ends up happening sometimes is people overpay and then they can't afford to build out networks. So you've got that problem. What they do in some countries like the United Kingdom, which is a very progressive regulatory regime, they actually even require, we don't require public safety, for instance, to bid on spectrum, but in the UK they do, because they believe it forces public safety to be more efficient in their spectrum use. So it's always a big problem. So it's very important when you look at this table that it not only you realize this isn't only commercial use, but it's federal government use, which is huge amount of spectrum. Spectrum is allocated internationally, and we can't do anything that would cause interference to another country. And actually, we want to have as common a table as any other country. And why would that be? Why do we want our table of allocations? Why do we want to have the same frequency uses as, say, people in Europe? Because you get economies of scale. And so it's cheaper to manufacture equipment. So this is good for those who are interested in IP. If I can build a cell phone that I can sell not only in the United States but across Europe and Asia, that's a lot more customers. That means my prices go down. So that's incredibly important for companies, right, to do this. It's also incredibly important, going back to my friend who's interested in international, it's cross-border communications. If the US, Canada, and Mexico, because we share common borders, don't do similar things, what happens? You have interference, and no one can communicate across the border. So a huge part of our effort, and we just failed miserably, and I'll tell you about that, is making sure that Mexico and Canada decide to do the same things we want to do, which they don't always want to, and we can't force them because they're sovereign nations. So for instance, this LTE band, 700 megahertz, Canada said, okay, we'll do what the US is doing. But Mexico just announced last week, we're not doing what the US is doing. We're doing something that doesn't work with the US. And so we have a big issue. Be happy you live in New York and not in Texas, because there may be a problem along, or San Diego, along the borders on communication. So these are important issues, the frequency side of things.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us, Jennifer. It was great talking with you tonight.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And this was the Media Reporter. Thank you for joining us.
Well, anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you.
It was very nice.
And it's great to meet you, too. I live in March.